Mary, welcome to the show. Um, I
Thank
was
you.
kind of getting knee deep into your. I'm not quite neck deep into your book yet, Healing Our World yet. But from what I've been reading so far, it's very good. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how what turned you into a libertarian?
Well, I became a libertarian in college pretty much when I read Ayn Rand's material, but that was back in the late 60s. So I didn't actually, of course, call myself a libertarian until the late 70s, early 80s, when the party was first founded. And I started running for office in the early 80s and have run so many times I've kind of lost count. So that's my libertarian background. I'm actually a research scientist by profession.
Okay.
And so, that influences a little bit about the way I write. I also was in Catholic school for 11 years. So I have um, an orientation that helps me talk to Christians and others that have a more spiritual bent, and I was involved in the environmental movement, so I can talk to people about that. And I'm very practical being a scientist. So I have one of the wonderful things about Healing Our World is that when I started writing it, I expected it to be a book on theory, but I actually started finding all of these studies showing how liberty works in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's, I think, probably still the largest compilation of studies, over 1,000 now, of how liberty works. So it's really been a fun thing putting it together.
Right, and I've done interviews with a couple of other libertarians, some of the presidential candidates for the Libertarian Party, and they're I don't say widely varied on how they view libertarianism, but they're definitely different. They definitely have a different outlook on the whole ideology of libertarianism. Uh, Adam Kokesh, who I've met before, he just wants almost complete anarchy, you know, which is his point of view. Max Abramson wants government, but he wants it to be a limited capacity. And of course, the great Vermin Supreme, who essentially just is basically, in my personal opinion of him, he's holding a mirror up to the two major parties and showing everybody how ridiculous they are. Because they all want, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle on, Republican or Democrat, they all want bigger government.
Yes, and that's part of the problem when we start having government. At least the way we define it today, government gets special privileges.
Mm-hmm.
Government has sovereign immunity. It doesn't have to restore its victims unless it wants to. And that tends to, that's a power that tends to be corruptive. So
Yeah.
government then tends to grow. So it's always a very difficult thing to have government, because if you have special privileges, then that creates a special class of people who want to keep those privileges and want to grow them. And that is the big problem with government as we define it today.
Right. And you can see that in all the alphabet agencies that are out there.
Yes.
A bunch of unelected bureaucrats who are essentially doing nothing more than just expanding their own authority.
Hmm. Well, and sadly, they're doing more than that. They're actually killing people.
Mm-hmm.
I recently put out a book called Death by Regulation, which, of course, looks at the FDA. And being a pharmaceutical research scientist, I got to see what happens behind the scenes. And what happens is, because of the long time that the FDA requires a company to do multitudes of studies, very few of which increase safety, the drugs, the life saving drugs, are kept off the market for about 12 years, probably 12 years more than they need to be. And that's really kind of scary, because a lot of people die waiting for new drugs, for example. And then, of course, because such a high standard of proof is required before any company can say that their product treats disease, inexpensive products like vitamins and minerals or diets
Mm-hmm.
can't make these claims because they can't, their manufacturer can't afford to go through that process. So instead of having simple, inexpensive treatments, we have these very expensive ones because their price keeps going up after all of these studies that they have to do.
Yeah, we've gone over a lot of that in depth on this show and on a couple other shows. The Medical Association in America is not really interested in curing anybody. They were interested in making money. And they just had a CEO come out and say that. Okay, we're not here to cure you. We're here to make money. We're here for the stockholders. That's it.
And that goes back to government again, because government has given corporations, of course, special privileges too.
Right.
And so because of that, because the owners or stockholders are not liable if the company does something very bad, these corporations don't really get the oversight they otherwise would from their owners. And before corporations were, here in the U.S., of course, owners were liable. And so they, had careful oversight of their company.
Yeah, there was a guy that was around years ago. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, named Max Gerson.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, okay. I did an interview with his grandson, and he ran down how Gerson had to fight not only the government, but big, IG Farben, which was the big pharmaceutical company in Europe, had to fight them because they were joined at the hip. And then when he came to America, it was the same thing that happened here.
That's right. He had to go to Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm familiar with him because I had a sister who died of cancer, and she did go to the Gerson Clinic there in Mexico.
Okay. But, yeah, it's like it's what Mussolini called, this is actually what the definition of fascism should be. It should be corporatism, because it's the joining of government and corporations.
Yes.
And they squash competition, and it doesn't allow for innovation. It doesn't allow for free markets to operate the way they're supposed to. And people suffer for it. And the cancer industry in general, I mean, the out-of-pocket expenses, not even what's covered by insurance, your out-of-pocket expenses are just phenomenal.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And cancer, for some reason, the FDA has always been extra hard on physicians who feel that they have a better way to treat cancer. I'm here in Texas, and of course, in Houston, Dr. Brzezinski has been trying to perfect his techniques for a long time, and the FDA keeps dragging him back into court, as does the medical board here in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So far, he's prevailed pretty much, but all this extra expense and time on his part to fight these things means that's time he's not spending with patients and helping cure the disease.
Yeah, I did some research into that too, which all of this really started around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, when the Rockefellers essentially bought up the Medical Association. They created their own university. They pretty much invested heavily into big pharma and said that the doctors are going to teach our curriculum and not things at work. And it turned into if you get further and further, it's like a spider web. You'll never stop researching to find out what all the facts of it are. But
yes.
Generally, it's people forcing their agenda on everybody else in order to fatten their bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
Whether you want it or not, when I go to like the Veterans Administration, which is like one of the biggest socialized medicine industries in America, it's the doctors really want to do well. The doctors there are great, but they're hamstrung by this regulation.
That's right.
And if I just go to them and say, no, I don't want your treatment anymore, I'm going to go to my own doctor. It's like, well, you're covering it. And I can't afford to cover my own medical bills like that. So I'm kind of stuck in there too. So.
Well, yes, about 80% probably even more actually, but at least 80% of the cost of the drugs that we pay for at the pharmacy are due to the FDA regulations that do not increase safety. So basically, that's wasted money on our part.
Mm-hmm.
And I strongly suspect it's the same in the medical profession. The thing is about the FDA, since, drugs are regulated nationally, you can actually make a calculation more easily than you can for the medical profession as a whole, because the medical profession and hospitals are regulated statewide. But what you could do, and I've thought about doing this, is looking state to state. And some people have done this. They've looked state to state and looked at what they call the certificate of need laws. These are laws where the existing hospitals get to say, hey, we don't want this new hospital because, it's not needed. We're fine. And when they do that, the care that is given at the hospitals under certificate of need states does seem to be poorer than in states without certificate of need laws. People end up having to come back to the hospital more often, or they have to stay longer on their second visit. In other words, it's not as good because, of course, when you have more hospitals and more competition, you're going to probably have better quality care.
Right. And I don't know how closely you've been watching the Democrat debates when they pop up, but every one of them is pushing Medicare for all or some kind of a universal health care system. And of course, it's always, when they do it, Bernie Sanders especially is huge on it. And every time he gets up there on the stage, he talks about, yes, we're going to raise your taxes. It's like, well, wait a minute. If I'm not using your medical system, why am I being forced to pay for it?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's even worse than that, because if you had a universal care system, the way it's always worked in other countries is they've had to ration care.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, what ends up happening is people will go to the doctor for every little thing because they're not paying for anything, at least not out of pocket. They're paying their taxes, but it's not so clear that they're paying that. So they feel they've paid it in their taxes, so they go to the doctors for every little sniffle. And then what ends up happening is that's what consumes the doctors. And then if they need something very expensive and even life-saving like kidney dialysis, oftentimes it's rationed. I know in Britain, about 20 years ago, they were not allowing people over 55 to get kidney dialysis in about 2 out of 3 cases, which is, a pretty restrictive thing. 55 is not that old.
Yeah.
And I know in Canada, people had to wait to get a CAT scan for months while their pets could get it the same day, because of course that wasn't regulated. So it's really very deadly.
Yeah, and that was
have a universal care system.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that they brought up. Is I think Bernie Sanders brought it up, is how great Canada's healthcare system is. And you can point example after example of how long these wait periods are, and you sometimes from the point of when they get on the waiting list to the time that they're actually going to be seen, the patient dies in between.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So, the only way really to lower the costs of healthcare and make it accessible for everyone from a cost standpoint is to get rid of the regulations that drive up the cost without adding any benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as you know, government is, very much oriented towards making more and more regulations that don't really make a lot of sense. And that's very true in the medical profession as well. In fact, healthcare is one of the most highly regulated, I guess I don't want to just say professions, more than that. It's hospitals and drugs and everything else, but it's most highly regulated sector, I guess I should say, of our of the normal things that we encounter in our daily life. And that's why it's so expensive. We don't need most of these regulations.
Right. And look what they did in California. As a matter of fact, they just had a meeting here in the neighboring county about this as well, is mandatory vaccinations.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And every time the government gets involved, our federal government gets involved in something, especially, the costs on it rise. It doesn't matter what it is, like college tuition. They got involved in that. Tuitions went up.
Mm-hmm.
So mandatory vaccines, and the guy in California who was pushing it, this state senator, I believe he is, named Pan, got a lot of money from the pharmaceutical companies to get this through.
Yes, and because vaccines are a biological product, they are more prone to side effects. In fact, what was happening for a long time is more and more companies were going out of the vaccine business, so much so that it got down to like 2 manufacturers. And that's when, of course, Congress passed the law that, okay, we're not going to make drug companies liable for any vaccine injuries. We're going to have this pot of money that we're going to use from the government and from taxes to compensate people. And once that happened, the vaccine industry just exploded because, of course, the liability for a biological product tends to be greater than for a chemical, because a chemical could be purified. You can make sure it's one thing, whereas a vaccine, it's not so easy.
Right. Well, and of course, you talked about this big pool of money, of taxpayer money that they're putting aside. That means a pharmaceutical company has zero liability, because if there's an injury that they're going to do a payout, we're the ones paying for it.
Exactly. And of course, the vaccines don't always work. These outbreaks of measles and things that we hear about, oftentimes it's vaccinated children that are the cause, because not every child responds to a vaccine. Your immune system has to be functioning properly for there to be a response. And in many cases, partly because of our diet, partly because our children don't get exercise the way they used to, and a number of other things, they are not responding. And so you will never have a situation where, even if you vaccinate every single child, that you're still going to have these outbreaks. It's just not going to go away.
Well, yeah, and I've brought this up before, is when I was growing up, when somebody got sick, like chicken pox or measles or whatever, parents used to send their kids over to that house.
Yes, I remember that. I'm in that generation too.
And your body builds up an immune system. You don't get sick from it for the rest of your life. But now it's mandated that you have to get the government approved one. And that's one of the things right now that I think a lot of people, a lot of libertarians are pushing back against, a lot of independents are pushing back against, is why does the government need to be involved in every aspect of our life? I mean, everything.
Right. Well, and the thing is, mandatory vaccination is very scary because you don't know what's in that vaccine. If they can inject you and or your children with, whatever they want to, and that's what this is opening the door to, then you can be injected with things that you would rather not have in your body.
Yeah.
You can easily see how you could have a situation where you're injected with something that makes you pliable.
Right. Yes, of course. Yeah, all the stabilizers that they put in there are basically they're toxins. When they were using mercury as a stabilizer, mercury is what they put in those fluorescent light bulbs that if you break one, you're supposed to call a hazmat team to come clean it up. But it's
yes.
when you talk about vaccines that way, it just brought this up to me. Bill Hicks, the comedian. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He's a fellow Texan, but he had this bit where he was talking about war and the soldiers having no idea what each of their different kinds of munitions did. So I said, "What does B-17 do?" Push the button. Cool. What does B-18 do? So when you're talking about vaccinations the way that you do, it's kind of like that. It just kind of reminded me of that, because it's like, what does this vaccine do? Inject it into somebody. Oh, okay. Hey, what does this one do? Inject it into somebody. Oh, okay. Because they're never sure of what the reactions are going to be right off until they go through these clinical trials and all of that. And meanwhile, they're still putting things out on the market that when the VA asks me, okay, you haven't had your vaccines in a while, and they'll list off about 5 or 6 of them and say, do you want to get them? I'll say no. And they get upset about it.
Mm-hmm.
But
yes, well, there's definitely a push to get everybody vaccines. And I think this mandatory vaccine thing it's very scary because, as I said, if they can inject you with a vaccine that's supposed to help you, they could easily inject you with something that is going to hurt you without your knowledge. It would not be hard to do.
Yeah, not that our government would ever do something like that. I'm thinking Tuskegee Airmen.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, and that's what's funny because they made all these regulations about how your human studies have to be reviewed by an ethical review board. I actually chair one of these things, and it's hilarious in a way because it's the government that usually is violating these principles, not the drug companies.
Right.
Because drug companies are liable if if somebody gets hurt on their study.
Right. And getting back into your book also, I'm going through the part where you're talking about taxation and, for our benefit because the majority of people wanted it. And it usually ends up creating more poverty, worse situations for people to live in and all of that. And some of the most highly taxed areas in our country are some of the worst places to live in.
Mm-hmm.
And you can say Los Angeles is a case study. I lived there for 26 years and watched that thing spiral down the drain. And every time, especially with the big homeless problem going on there now, the response from the city council and the county board of supervisors and the state of California is, well, we need to raise your taxes to take care of the homeless problem. But the homeless problem is still increasingly getting worse.
Well, and they don't take care of the homeless problem. I mean, if you want welfare, you have to have an address. So by definition, unless a homeless person has somebody who will, pretend that they live there, they can't get a welfare check.
Mm-hmm. Right. But more to the point, I think, is this person went out and became a drug addict. I didn't force him to. Or this person has a mental health issue, okay? Or this person just wants to live on the street for whatever reason. Why is it my responsibility to fork over my money to pay for that?
Yeah, well, it isn't. And actually, if you look at how the homeless people actually get money, they get it from private individuals. It's the only place they get it because the government isn't helping them at all. When they say they want to take care of the homeless problem, they usually mean they want to drive them out of the parks and things of this nature. It doesn't mean they're going to give them money. Most of the homeless people get money from, contributions when they basically hold out their hand and ask for it. Mm-hmm.
Right. In Los Angeles, it's a little more insidious than that because I watched it happen, and I have friends of mine who are involved in it. They found the government and their cronies have found a way to monetize the homeless situation. There's tens of millions, almost $100 million sitting there waiting to be distributed to for the homeless problem. And the only thing it's gone to so far is some real estate developers who are charging $700,000 per unit for homeless shelters.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So yeah, they found a way to make money off it. So I keep telling people back in California, the homeless problem is never going to go away. Number one, the government's involved in it. There's cronies involved in it. And as long as that money keeps flowing in and people don't speak up about the waste of their taxes and vote these people out of office, it's never going to change.
Well, and it's even worse than that. In New York City, Mother Teresa's nuns wanted to convert one of these condemned buildings into a homeless shelter. Mm-hmm. And they bought the property for $1 because it was, totally worthless, and the city had it. So they just, sold it for $1. And then the city approved their development plan, but then the city came back and said, well, you have to install elevators. And because that was going to cost $100,000, the nun said, we don't want to spend that kind of money on an elevator. The homeless people will be very happy to go up a flight of stairs. But because the city kept insisting on it, they eventually gave up the project. Right. And here in Texas, where there was holiday meals, hot holiday meals given out to the homeless and probably anybody else who stood in line, the city forbade them to do that because they were feeding more than 70 people. So what they did here in Texas is we have open carry. So they, the people who wanted to feed the homeless strapped on guns and stood there and passed out the hot food. And I think wisely the policemen decided that they wouldn't mess with them. I mean,
that's great.
I mean, people are being shut down all over. This is not unusual. If you Google, cities that won't let you feed the homeless, you will get a number of hits. Yeah. This is becoming quite popular to forbid people to, give hot meals to the homeless because they don't have a commercial kitchen. So if they're doing it out of their homes, they're not allowing them to do this. It's just nuts.
Yeah, they had a retiree in Florida who actually got arrested for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
But see, the government's not doing it either. So
well, that's right. They don't. I'll tell you, sometimes I think the government doesn't really like the homeless and the poor, except, if they can use them as, hey, we'll help the poor, so vote for me. Because I was rehabbing low-income housing in Michigan, and I was told by the city inspectors that I had to lengthen the kitchen counters by 2 inches, for example. And I said, well, if you have this big list for me that you want me to change things like this that don't really, matter to, the low income people that are coming to rent here, I'll have to, raise my rents. And they said, that's really good. We want you to do that. We don't want these low income people to be living in our city. So, when you hear
right.
things like this, you just really wonder where these people are coming from and who they're protecting. They're not taking care of the poor.
Yeah, they did that in California when the homeless started actually branching out and getting down into the more affluent areas of the city, down by the beach, up in the hills. Mm-hmm. That's when the complaints started coming in, and that's when the city started taking action and shuffling all these people down to Skid Row.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's really sad because so many people actually believe that the government is the friend of the poor, and it's just the opposite. All these regulations we were talking about earlier, really drive people out of business and actually prevent them from getting that first job. Mm-hmm. There's so many examples of this, I hardly know where to start. I'll just say that the nonprofit Libertarian Institute for Justice takes on a lot of the cases of really crazy regulations that keep people from working, like the African American hair braiders. Most states wanted to force them to get a cosmetology license where they don't learn braiding at all.
Yeah.
After all, these people are the experts, right? So and of course that costs about a year of time, and depending on the state, about $5,000. And they can't afford that, and so they were being driven out of business. And it's the libertarians who have come and tried to help them, not the Republicans and Democrats. They're all for this regulation, So you really have to wonder about. When people think they think government's a friend of the poor, it actually hurts the poor. In fact, this is why the third world is still poor. Their governments have more regulations than we do. And in addition, in most third world countries, it's very hard to get what we call free and clear title. Most people squat on government land because the government owns pretty much all the land, and it doesn't give free and clear title to a private person easily. So, for example, one of the things that Liberty International does, another nonprofit libertarian organization, is, and I chair that group right now, and we're trying to raise money for GPS units so that volunteers can go and take this GPS into a rural community and everybody can agree on their boundaries in that area. And if they do that and then they apply for free and clear title with no arguments between them, they can get it a little more easily than if they were applying, individually. And overnight, their property values double. The poor people of the third world are actually sitting on land that if it were homes, if they were acknowledged as homesteaders and given free and clear title, they would be a lot better off than they are now, significantly better off. But it doesn't seem like government wants to help them do that either.
Yeah, and one of the other things I was reading in your book, which brought up a current issue going on here, is you talked about, I guess, when you were going through college, how you would volunteer to go work in the labs for little money or no money at all, just for the experience. And other people wouldn't do it because, oh no, I need to be paid to do the work, and so they never developed skills or relationships with people in the industry. And later on, that helped you later on down the road.
That's right. And one of the other things in that story is that eventually that volunteering was not allowed because the minimum wage started covering it. And when that happened,
right,
the laboratories couldn't afford minimum wage. So the only way you could get in the lab and do what I had been doing is to actually sign up for a course of independent research. Of course, you had to pay money for that.
Right.
So if you couldn't afford to pay money for it, you couldn't do it anymore.
Right. And that's where I was kind of going with it, was the whole minimum wage thing, and talking about, okay, government people demand it, government steps in and they say, okay, you want $15 an hour minimum wage now to flip burgers. And going back to how regulations makes people poor, what was the response from like the fast food industry or these entry-level jobs is they're finding ways to automate those positions and putting people out of work.
That's right. That's right. And I remember back in the days when we used to have ushers in the theaters, and we don't have them anymore because, of course, they would have had to pay them minimum wage. So minimum wage destroys jobs, and the people it hurts the most are the disadvantaged. Because if you're going to pay a high wage as an employer, you're going to get the best person for that job. And that best person isn't going to be somebody that you need to train. And it used to be that a person that didn't have experience could say, hey, I'll work for less than this person with experience so that, because I know I'll need some training and that's going to cost you a little time and effort. So I'll just take less money, but I'll get that experience. And if you don't want to give me a raise after that because you just can't afford another full-time person, maybe you can give me a reference and I can go to someone else and get a job. But that's not happening anymore because obviously you can't negotiate a lower wage or you can't volunteer. Right.
And I think a lot of that has come out of this idea of entitlement. That's being pushed by politicians. It's being pushed by organizations and mostly left wing, far left wing, that you are entitled to this, even if you don't know what you're doing.
Yes. And I have to say, it's partly due in a perverse way to our prosperity. Back when I was a child, we always heard these stories about how our parents had to walk 5 miles to the schoolhouse,
uphill,
and come home and bale hay or whatever. And of course, as we've gotten more prosperous, our children haven't had to do that type of work as a child, and so they have grown up without necessarily having a strong work ethic. And then they get to be an adult, they're expected to have this work ethic, and they haven't had the training. And in fact, part of the reason they haven't had the training is the minimum wage and the child labor laws keep them out of the job market for a very long time now. It's not like it used to be. So you can't, you have a trouble as a parent, I think, instilling the work ethic in the same way that would have happened naturally, say, 50 years ago. And of course, no parent wants their child to suffer. They want to give them as much as they can. And sometimes they forget that they need to teach them that work ethic or they're not going to survive in the real world.
Right. And going along with that also is this concept that's reared its head in the last, I want to say 10 years or so, is this protected class of citizens.
So if you explain that a little more.
Okay. Oh, it's anybody who falls into a category in the United States where you're no longer allowed to say anything negative about them. And you're talking about the LGBT community, minorities, whatever category they want to put in. Suddenly everybody's a victim.
Yes.
And
yes.
there was an example where my mom's boyfriend was working at like one of those home improvement stores. I don't remember if it was Lowe's or Home Depot. And one of the people there suddenly came out of the closet, started coming to work in dresses. You know, he's a guy, came into work in dresses and was completely off limits. Could not even be fired because of federal regulation. And as a result of it, this person started, I got all the stories, this person started not doing their job and not having to do their job because they could not be fired.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually they did get fired because they turned around and belted a customer.
Ooh.
But that's to the point where it got before they could actually do anything because, and it turns out that happens quite a bit. You cannot fire people simply based on this victim mentality that we got going on. The employer has no say in it because of federal oversight, federal regulations that are crippling businesses.
Yes, I've seen that myself, actually. And the sad thing about it is that when that happens, people who were kind of on the fence about being prejudiced or not actually become prejudiced because what they're seeing is a bad example. And that's so sad.
Yeah, that's what's known as blowback. It's the unintended consequences of all of this. There's a huge backlash that's forming.
Mm-hmm.
That being a libertarian myself, and it took me a long time to realize that's what I was, because Democrats think I'm a Republican, Republicans think I'm a Democrat, so I'm perfectly happy with that. But I'm under the idea that whatever you want to do with your own life, knock yourself out. I don't care as long as it doesn't affect me in a negative way or cost me money. You know, I think it was Thomas Jefferson had a really brilliant saying especially when it came to like religion specifically. He said, "What difference does it make to me whether my neighbor worships one god or 50 gods? It neither breaks my leg or picks my pocket."
Mm-hmm. That's right. You know, it's interesting though, because the very people who want that, I've seen this too, the very people who want to be able to practice the religion the way they want to, oftentimes, unfortunately, want to impose it on others. And that's where they threaten their own ability to practice as they want. So that's something important, I think, to watch out for, especially when, because of whatever our religious beliefs are, we would like to see people doing something differently. We have to remember that if we want our freedom to worship or our freedom to do as we choose, we have to give it to others. And that's something that I think a part of the equation that a lot of people miss. They want to force others to their will, but they don't want other people to do the same to them. And of course, It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I've tried to explain this to a lot of people, and when I was living in California, especially when they start demanding that government needs to do something, and I keep telling them, government is more than willing to do something about it. You just have to be ready for the consequences of it, because they're going to regulate, and you're going to be underneath that regulation. Mm-hmm. Okay, they have no problem assuming power that you're willing to give them under, for whatever. It doesn't really matter what the issue is. When people go to government and demand that they do something, government turns around and goes, yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes they'll do more than they're asked to do.
Uh-huh.
Edward Snowden showed us that.
Yeah, especially, and he's come out with with some things afterwards. As a matter of fact, he just did an interview where he was talking about what it's like having to live in Russia because he can never come back home again.
Mm-hmm.
And what did he do? All he did was expose the fact that the NSA is spying on every single American in the country.
Right. It's breaking the law, but they want to put him in jail.
Yes. Yes. It's a do as I say, not as I do. And this is where I think our government has really gone overboard doing this mass surveillance. And then they started codifying it, saying that it was perfectly okay.
Yes, and this is the problem. Again, something we talked about earlier in the show. This is the problem when we have government, because it has, special immunities. It is able to do things that a common citizen wouldn't be able to do. And as the saying goes, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it seems like it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to keep a government going that is going to really protect its citizens from aggression without being an aggressor itself.
Yeah, and a good example of that is I've just got my application for concealed carry, and they give you a list of laws that you have to follow in order before you can draw your weapon and use it against somebody. These are the steps that have to be taken. These are the things you cannot do and the things you can do. And you read through them. Some of them are reasonable. But in some cases, they almost contradict themselves in a situation where you may have to make a snap judgment and draw your firearm and use it in a case of self-defense. They may be able to put you in jail for. However, I have also seen cases where local law enforcement or state law enforcement has absolutely no problem drawing their weapon in a situation where they really didn't need to kill somebody, and then the departments and the investigative body turns around and said, nope, they were acting within policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's different for you and me and the government. That's what I mean. They have sovereign immunity. Generally speaking, but if you look at the level at which they can exert force and the level at which you can exert force to protect yourself, it's quite different.
Mm-hmm. And without them actually knowing what the situation is or what happened, they'll still turn around and try to prosecute, because that's what they do. I mean, Kamala Harris, look at her record. She wants to be president. Her record as Attorney General in California is abysmal. She would suppress exculpatory evidence just so to keep people in prison, just to make her pad her record and make her look good.
Mm-hmm. Yet and this is not unusual.
Yeah, and she's not held accountable for it.
That's right. Well, it's not unusual. I think if you look at the Innocence Project and what they've found, and other studies too that look at people who have been unjustly convicted, the primary reason that they've been unjustly convicted is prosecution misconduct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they've come up with quite a few of those. I know about the Innocence Project, and not even just them, but there's been, I'd say, more honest district attorneys or more honest lawyers who've gotten involved in some cases where they did find the suppression of evidence, find that people have been wrongfully convicted, but still spent 20, 25 years in prison. Mm-hmm. Now, how do you give that time back to them?
No, there is no way.
Right.
There's no way. And it's business about innocent until proven guilty. That's really not the way you're treated usually, because if you can't afford bail, or if bail isn't set, you're kept in jail until your trial. And, trials are not speedy. It's usually a year at least. And so, how do you get that back? You don't.
No, and not even on major things. They're willing to go for even low-level things. I've seen instances where police would issue a ticket. Okay, you go fight the ticket. The issuing officer is supposed to show up in court. Usually doesn't, which should automatically make it dismissed. But because it's your word versus an officer's word, you lose.
Yes.
Automatically. The judge will not side in your favor.
Well, and if you think about it, the judges see the prosecutors every day.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them probably get to be buddy or friends, so there's going to just be a natural inclination to trust the prosecution. After all, basically they're employees of the same city or county or federal district.
Right.
So it's very natural. It's a natural human thing. So if anything, that should be discounted, not accepted. But that's not the way it is.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other things, I don't know if you've ever had the honor of serving on jury duty or been called for it.
A long time ago, yes.
But the last time I was called in, the judge in the case, and I only got the basics of the case because I wasn't selected to be on the actual jury. But the judge came up with the instructions of, do you have an issue with accepting the law as I present it to you? And my response is always, yes, I do. Because I want to see what the law says. Mm-hmm. I don't want you to explain it to me. I want to know what the law says verbatim. Mm-hmm. And
yes, and you as a juror, you're empowered to judge the law as well as the guilt or innocence of the person, who's on trial. So judges don't like you to know that.
No, they don't. Matter of fact, if usually a lot of times that I've seen where the jury comes back with a not guilty verdict on some cases, the judge actually gets angry about it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But and one of the worst courts is the tax courts. I don't know if you're even familiar with how those work.
Yeah, it's not a trial by jury, and you have to pay the tax before you go to trial.
Yeah, and
it's cruel and unusual punishment in my book.
And you don't get to have the law on your side. The Irwin Schiff case, the guy who wrote the book, The Federal Mafia, and basically explained how income taxes were actually illegal, mm-hmm. was dragged up in a court and told the judge, I'm be more than willing to pay the tax. You just show me the law that says I have to. Mm-hmm. And they didn't bother to present any evidence, and he got sentenced to prison for the rest of his life. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this is where our government is. It's like, you are going to do what the whole idea of the way the Constitution was written back in 1789 and our Bill of Rights ratified in 1791, that we are supposed to be sovereign. We are supposed to be above the government, has been completely reversed at this point.
That's correct. You're so right. They aren't public servants anymore.
No, they're our lord and masters and our overseers.
Yes, unfortunately.
And they view themselves that way. And then when you hold them accountable, I mean, I've tried to get my congressman to answer questions, and he just absolutely refuses to do it anymore. Mm-hmm. He doesn't feel like he's accountable to the people. Of course, except in an election time where he comes out and asks everybody to vote for him.
Yes, of course. And that's a whole nother issue too. Are the electronic voting machines actually spewing out the correct count of the votes? That's been up in the air for quite a while, and I'm not sure I trust them.
I don't. As a matter of fact, I absolutely don't trust them, because I have seen documentation where these machines are so easily hacked into, mm-hmm. and can flip elections. Even back in, more than a decade ago, the Diebold machines, when California certified those as good for the elections, they were proven to be flipping votes. I mean, people would go in and do a test on the voting machines, and it wouldn't register the vote the same way they want to. Or the same way they voted, and people were actually at the polls saying, "Hey, this machine is flipping my vote." So I don't even use the electronic voting machines. I demand a paper ballot when I vote.
Mm-hmm. And do they count those? Do they even count the absentee ballots?
Yeah, that's a big question. Well, they're counting something, because they keep finding boxes of them when the polls close, buried in a cellar somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
you have to wonder. So you have to wonder if these elections are even correct, if they're even legitimate. I know I have a lot of doubts.
Yeah, I'm almost at a point where I don't even feel like voting anymore because it almost seems pointless. George Carlin had a really great bit about that where he talked about why he doesn't vote. And it was, well, because I don't vote because I don't want to be part of this system. And if you tell me that I have no right to complain because I didn't vote, I think I have every right to complain. And you don't have any right to complain because you did vote and you're the one who voted in this crappy system and the people that are running it.
Oh,
So,
well, and it is a difficult system because, as you know, it's very difficult for parties that aren't Republican or Democrat to even get on the ballot. I mean, they have this. Maybe your listeners aren't aware of this, but for example, libertarians. As libertarians, if we don't get a certain percentage of the vote, we have to requalify for each and every election by getting tens of thousands of signatures per state.
yeah.
And I mean, if you're a party just starting out, of course you aren't going to get,
Right.
a large number of votes because you're just starting out. So it really penalizes any newcomer.
Right.
It's just another regulation to keep the newbies out, just like regulations in professions keep the competition down because it becomes hard for anyone who wasn't grandfathered in to meet those qualifications.
Yeah. And guess who came up with those election regulations?
Must have been the Democrats and Republicans.
Imagine that.
The system's really crooked, and it's sad because for a long time Americans were so proud of their government, and the reason I think that they were able to be proud is it used to be so small, it didn't do much damage, so people were really thrilled because in other countries, of course, governments were screwing everything up and ruining the potential prosperity of the country. But now what's happened is we've had freedom, we've had prosperity, and we haven't. I really think most people in the country today don't realize where their prosperity came from. They don't understand what freedom actually means. So when government's passing a new regulation, they think that's freedom, and that's pretty scary.
Yeah, I look at how much since the Revolution War up until I'm going to say 1913, just off the top of my head, not really, but for all those years in between, because government was pretty much out of the picture, we were the most prosperous country on the planet. We went even far above what England had done.
Yes.
And England used to rule the colonies, and then when we got out from under their thumb, we got out from under the thumb of the monarchy, we became the most prosperous. People were flocking to this country. People were writing books about how great America was. Mm-hmm.
And we've grown into a monster. I mean, we think about how we are going into these poorer nations and either supporting their tyrants or actually bringing troops in to devastate their landscape. It's really It's very disheartening.
Smedley Butler wrote a whole book about it, or a series of speeches that he gave called War is a Racket. And basically talked about how the U.S. military in the 20th century especially was nothing more than muscle for big companies. Mm-hmm. And
yes, it's unfortunate. If this is what we've done with our freedom and prosperity, I like and I don't recall who said this, I tremble for my country. Because, I think he said because God is just, but another way of saying it is, what goes around comes around. And when it comes around, I think we're going to be in deep shock.
Yeah. And it really amazes me when I watch these debates, or if I watch any politician going for screen time, is how they talk so reverently about our founding fathers and the Constitution. And it's like, listening to some of the things that they say, it's like, number one, you don't know what the Constitution says, and I know that because I've gone over that with my congressman. And number two, their actions say exactly the opposite.
Exactly.
They look at the Constitution as a hindrance.
Yes.
For what they want to do. And they've been regulating it out of existence for hundreds of years, 150 years or more at this point.
Yeah, well, ever since it was put into place, I think.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
let's focus on the positive though, because I do want to. Some of your listeners might get the impression that we are saying it's hopeless, but I want to put
No.
some hope back in.
Well, I don't.
And,
Just on that, I don't think just pointing out the problems is pointing out that it's hopeless. It's like if you don't know what the problem is, you don't know how to fix it.
well, exactly. And I think that we do know how to fix it. We need to go back to, basically the non-aggression principle. Deciding that we're not going to initiate force, fraud, or theft against our neighbor, and if we do, that we're going to restore them as much as possible. And the thing is, you don't need a lot of people. You don't need the majority to embrace that principle for things to change. There's been a number of studies done on what causes paradigm shifts in cultures. And somewhere between 5 and 10% of the people being passionate about something is all you need. And if you think about it, that was probably, I think maybe one of the easiest, closest things we can think about is the concept of slavery. That was around for a long time. And yet, even though there were abolitionists, there weren't that many of them really passionate about it. But there were enough, 5 to 10% of the population to really change things. And I think that in these kinds of discussions we're having, identifying the problem, as you just mentioned, and then seeing what we need to do to get back to where we need to be, recognizing that it doesn't take a majority because most people are followers. Most people aren't going to push one way or the other. So if we can just get a passionate minority involved in this, then we can change things. And there's another reason I think we can change things, and that is because really I think almost everybody, if not everybody, benefits from freedom. Liberty is not something that just helps the disadvantaged. Of course, it does help the disadvantaged the most, I'll say that. But even those who think they profit by the system the way it is, even those who think power and money are their birthright, so to speak, they really don't. They really are hurt by the current system. And I'm going to give a couple quick examples.
Okay.
So for example, all of these, we talked about the pharmaceutical and the medical industry and how it's being wrecked by government. Well, what that means is that the diseases that aren't cured yet, like cancer, for example, which doesn't have a very high cure record, really, it means that even people with oodles of money and power, when they get sick, they might get the best treatment, but the best treatment is not necessarily going to save them. I mean, we have some problems with our treatments. We have treatments that don't exist yet because the whole innovative system has been squashed by all these regulations. So first of all, even if you have a lot of power and money and you get sick, you cannot buy a cure that hasn't been invented yet. And so one of the downsides of all this regulations, even if you accumulate money and power, it doesn't help you if you've destroyed the innovative character of your country. And then there's also another component that maybe biologically based, if you will. I had the opportunity once to talk to someone who did a lot of the propaganda for these politicians. And in other words, helping create propaganda that made people vote against their own best interests because it convinced them of things that weren't true. And I saw he wasn't a very happy person. So the first thing I asked him was, well, what are your goals in life? And he said power and money. But he already had power and money. So then I asked him, well, what do you think would make you happy? And it was years before I really understood his answer. What he told me was this. He said, I think to be happy, I would need to feel connected to humankind, and I don't. And if you think about it for a moment, anyone who aggresses or defrauds or cheats or lies about their neighbor, before they can do that, they sort of have to emotionally separate themselves from them. Because if you identify with them, you would never hurt them that way. So when you're doing all these nasty things to other people to acquire your power and money, when you're aggressing against them and trying to acquire this power and money so you can be happy, you've actually sabotaged your end as you've gotten started, because you've had to separate yourself from humankind. And we are a social species. There is something in us that I think requires at least some degree of compatibility and connection with those around us. And so as I thought about this more, I realized that those who aggress against others probably in the end are going to find that no matter how much power and money they have, they may not find the happiness that they seek. Will they realize it? Possibly not. But that's why it's good that we only need 5 to 10% of the people to really embrace something like the non-aggression principle to make it the law of the land. Right. So I just thought I'd throw that out, because I really think that liberty is something that really helps just about everyone. In fact, I would say probably everyone. and that's my experience of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I used to be part of the group of people who was, this is the way the system is. We don't know how to fix it. And later on, when I got involved more into politics, and I actually had time to sit down and read for, instead of having to go to work every single day the way I was, I got more involved in this. And that's when Ron Paul, he's the guy who had flipped the switch for me. And that's where I learned about free markets, of voluntary association, not the non-aggression principle, like you were saying, and all these other great libertarian ideas. And it's like, wait a minute, there is a way to fix everything.
Yes, and isn't it wonderful?
Yeah, it's like that. The little gerbil got on the wheel, and the light bulb went on over my head, and said, "Hey, wait a minute! We don't have to keep the system going the way it's going. We have an out."
That's right.
So,
and I've asked libertarians before who complain, "Oh my gosh, the system's so horrible, nothing can happen. We're all doomed." I say, well, if you could wave a magic wand and go back to thinking like everyone else does.
Yeah. Would you go back and take the blue pill?
Exactly. And not one of them has ever said, I would go back. Because there's an elevation of consciousness, I think, that happens when you recognize that there is a way for us to all prosper together. That it's not a win-lose situation. It's a win-win situation. And I think that's so inspiring and we recognize it internally. We really do. And so no one wants to give away that knowledge, even though sometimes it's painful.
Yeah. And I mean, I see it all the time, quite honestly. When I'm in Los Angeles, I'll see bits and pieces of it there, regardless of how slanted that town is. And I'll see it out here where I live now. People are actually, because it's being the agenda has been pushed so far in one direction, people are actually pushing back the other way. They're open to the ideas that libertarians will tell them. That, look, yes, you don't have to do it this way. There's another way to get around that. And yes, it works better. And they're like, oh, well, yeah. Some of them are very resistant to it. I mean, to use an old analogy, I mean, watch the Matrix movie. Some people don't want to wake up. Mm-hmm. They absolutely refuse to, but there are more than a few who are willing to and look at the ideas and go, hey, wait a minute. Yeah, there is a better way of doing this.
Mm-hmm. And if I recall that movie correctly, it was a minority that wanted to wake up, and they were able to change the world.
Mm-hmm. Yep, they changed everything. Mm-hmm. And it was, I mean, I think that movie resonated a lot in different ways for a lot of different people, but
yes.
And I don't even think the people that made the movie, the Wachowskis, I don't even think that they had an idea that movie was going to have that kind of a reaction. But it did. And it's like, also watch The Hunger Games sometime.
Oh, yes.
That had a lot of libertarian principles involved in it.
Yes.
And I was, and that's one of the reasons I like watching it, and a lot of people got very stuck on, oh my God, it's children killing children. And that's all they could see.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, wait a minute, you look at this from a different angle and look at what happens. Look at the principles that are being put out in this film, whether it was intentional or not, that's what's there.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it takes that for people to wake up and suddenly go, hey, wait a minute, our country's not being run right. There is a better way to do it. An original way, the original way the founders had set it up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we really can get back to that. I'm hoping that enough people do wake up before we get into something so far gone that there's no turning back. But at this point, I don't think we've crossed the Rubicon yet.
Mm-hmm. No, well, we're biologically programmed for freedom.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about it, as a species, we do not thrive without freedom. And it wasn't until we ended up with political freedom, which happened when the United States was founded. And then, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Britain rolled back a lot of its most offensive laws shortly after that. That allowed the Industrial Revolution to happen. Prior to that, in the thousands and thousands of years that humankind existed,
Mm-hmm.
it existed on about $1 a day in today's money. I mean, very poor, very poor. Everyone was poor. Even the people who were kings were poor by today's standards.
Right.
So, if you think about it, we need freedom to not just to survive. We barely were surviving, but to thrive. If we want to thrive, we need freedom. And there's something in us that tells us that, which is why, there are species that won't breed in captivity. Now, humans probably would, but still there is a very strong urge for freedom for its own sake. And, that's something that is inside us. It's our evolutionary imperative. So we are going to fight for freedom in one way or another, just because we're built that way. Yeah,
and all you have to do is look at historical examples of how oppressive governments and oppressive regimes across the planet have always collapsed in on themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Every single time, because people stopped working.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I mean, I've talked with people who came out of those Eastern Bloc countries when the Soviet Union was still running them, and they were telling me what the conditions there were like, and you got all the example, the buildings are crumbling and infrastructure is terrible and all that. But more importantly, the people there just stopped caring. They refused to do anything that put an effort into it because there was no reward at the end of it.
That's right. It's like they said, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work.
Uh-huh. Exactly.
Yes, I think in China Russia. Russia had, I think, 10% of their land was actually, they allowed people to grow food privately, and it produced something like 40% of the country's production, just because obviously if it's yours and you can keep it, you're going to tend to it.
Right. Even in before the United States was formed, when the Pilgrims came over, when they talk about the story of the first Thanksgiving and, there's a giant meal and everybody sat down with the Indians and they had a great time. And then that's not exactly what happened.
That's right.
The original story was they started out as a socialist system. And the governor, I forget what the governor's name was, but he basically said that everybody's going to grow food and we're all going to put it in a big pile and take what we need as we need it. And it turned out that some people didn't work. Mm-hmm. And that collapsed that whole system down very, very quickly. And finally, he turned around and said, okay, that doesn't work. So now what we're going to do is you're going to take your own land and grow what you want, and everybody prospered for it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. We should have learned that lesson. I think we should keep repeating that every Thanksgiving, because somehow people are talking about socialism and how great it is. And we've had this example from our own history. Right.
But if they're never taught it in school, because I wasn't taught that when I was in school either.
No, I wasn't either. But
But it's worth repeating.
It's worth repeating.
And again, it shows you here's the problem. You recognize the problem. There is a way to fix it. And the fix is always individual liberty. Let the people do what they need to do. Let the businesses, the free market run itself, because it'll always fix itself. And get the government out from everybody's business.
Mm-hmm.
It works, believe it or not. Freedom works.
That's right. It does, and I have hundreds of references, over 1,000 in Healing Our World that point to that. And it's a wonderful thing, because if freedom didn't work, we wouldn't be pushing for it. But it works because it's right, and the proof that it's right is that it works.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I have yet to see a system better. I know that there's some people who want to push individual liberty to the point of anarchism, but that doesn't work either. But I have yet to see a system that founded a country better than the one we had when the Constitution was written. Because I don't think there is one.
Well, the Constitution did have a few flaws, and maybe that's part of what went wrong. But I have the feeling that we could actually do everything privately. And the reason I say that is when you do it through government, again, you're giving government special privileges. And when you do that, the power corrupts. So I think we might be able to do it all privately. And in Healing Our World, I go through some possible private solutions at every level. So I'll be interested in hearing what you think after you've read the whole book. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, like I said, I'm getting through it, but so far I haven't found anything in it that I've disagreed with. By the way, tell everybody where they can get your book.
Sure. Well, of course, Amazon has all my books, but you can also get them at my website, ruwart.com, RUWART.com. And you can write me there if you have any questions. Just go to the About tab and you'll get an option to contact me directly.
Okay. And you're on social media too?
Yes, I'm on Facebook. I have 2 Facebook pages, Mary J Ruwart and Mary J Ruwart PhD. I have Instagram. If you go to my website, you can click on all of the different ones to find out where I am.
There you go. So yeah, be sure everybody, if you get a chance, pick up the book. It's worth the read. I haven't finished it yet, but to me it's a good book. It's good. It really does explain. I rank it right up there with The Creature from Jekyll Island, and The Fed that Ron Paul wrote, and Adam Kokesh's book Freedom. I think that. So I mean, it's a great book if you want to understand what libertarian philosophy is.
Well, and actually, the 1993 version is in my free library. So if, for some reason you don't want to buy the book or you want to see it first, you can go to the free library, or you can get the 2015 edition at my website or on Amazon. And Ron Paul did do the foreword for that.
Oh, that's nice. I always look up to that guy.
Yes.
I think I've said this to a few people. He's probably the only politician who, when he dies, I will go out of my way to go to the funeral. Mm-hmm. Because I can't honestly stand anybody else.
He is a very special man.
Yeah, he set the bar for me.
Yes.
When I got into the Ron Paul's campaign in 2011, 2012, and that's when everything started. The light started coming on, and I read what he was doing. I read his books and everything. It was like that. He's not a politician. He's a statesman. And this is the kind of people we should be looking for to be in our government, because they would shrink it down fast and put this country back on the track it's supposed to be. And
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have too many of those. But anyway, do you have time for more, or do you need to go?
I could stay on for a few more minutes, and then I'll need to go.
Okay. So, going back into your book, since I'm up to the part about the taxation. What haven't I got to yet? Just give me a couple of spoilers.
Oh, okay. So you're just on the first couple chapters?
I'm halfway through chapter 3 right now.
Okay, that's the minimum wage chapter. Well, I go on to talk about how regulations destroy jobs and kind of talk about how we put layer and layer and layer of aggression on things. For example, it's one thing when you have the choice to um, choose a business that's regulated or not regulated, but in some cases, you have no choice but regulated businesses. You have monopolies you have to choose from. And in other cases, you're actually forced to use it, just like the Fed. We're sort of forced to use the Fed in essence because we have to pay our taxes, at least with Federal Reserve notes. So,
Right.
we are for, and as each layer of aggression is put on there, things get worse and worse. And so I kind of do that step by step. That's the first half of the book. The second half of the book, I focus on how important restitution is as a way to make sure that the non-aggression principle is balanced. Now, let me give you an example because I think it's easier to see it. So, for example, if you and I were standing on a street corner and you grabbed me because I was looking at my cell phone and I stepped out in traffic and you saw a truck was going to hit me, you would initiate force against me. You would grab me and push me to the sidewalk instead of the road, right? So, but I wouldn't want any restitution from you. I'd probably be giving you a reward for saving my life.
Right.
And this is where if you look on the internet, people, even libertarians, sometimes criticize the non-aggression principle because they think it means things that it doesn't. And the reason that they get lost is this restitution thing. For example, there's, and I don't really go into this too much in the book. What I'm telling you now is not in the book, so your listeners will probably enjoy it. So what ends up happening, for example, if you're hiking out with your child in this remote area and your child falls and broke bones, just, his thigh bone is sticking out of his leg, he needs to get to a hospital pretty quickly, but, you can't really carry him all that way. And you see a house and a garage, and the garage has a car, but there's no one home. So do you break in and take the car? You probably do, knowing you're going to have to pay restitution and not knowing what it is yet, because you don't know what the consequences will be to the owner of that car. So you take your kid to the hospital and you find the owner, and probably the owner's going to say, I'm just glad my car was there for you to use. But if, like the owner's wife dies because he can't get her to the hospital when she needs it, then your restitution is going to be a lot greater. So, we do things, and libertarians don't generally acknowledge this, but we do things where we might violate the non-aggression principle, but the support for that, or the counter for that, is that we pay restitution and make it whole again. Right. And if we don't recognize this, then I think we can get into trouble. I've seen things on the internet like, if you were falling from a building and you landed on somebody's deck and they said, hey, I don't want you on my deck, you'll need to just jump off again and fall to your death. That you wouldn't be a real libertarian because you wouldn't fall to your death. Well,
right.
That's just not right. You'd trespass and you'd expect to pay restitution.
Yeah, but I don't know if that kind of thing would actually fall under trespass because it wasn't intentional.
Most people, of course, would say, I'm so glad my deck was there to save your life.
Yeah. I'm glad my deck broke your fall.
Exactly. And they'd be calling for help for you and everything else. That's the way most people would be. But if somebody said, well, I need everything you own because I saved your life with my deck, and you disagreed with that, of course, you could go to court. And then, it would be interesting to see what a libertarian court would do. I suspect nobody would take you to court because they would look like such an idiot.
I think if there was a libertarian court, the judge would probably have laughed it right out the door.
Yeah. So, but this check and balance of restitution is a really good way, because there are situations where, you might feel like feel justified in initiating force or stealing something. Not that you'd want to, but, this is an important thing to think about as libertarians, because there's a lot out on the internet saying how we aren't true libertarians because we wouldn't do things like fall to our death if somebody didn't want us on their deck. So it's important to know about that.
Well, not intentionally anyway.
No. But anyhow, a lot of people don't think restitution can happen with criminals because they think people steal because they don't have anything. But I go through all that in, the second half of the book and show how restitution is a very viable alternative, how it actually heals, the rift between the aggressor and the victim. Mm-hmm. And then go on to show how when you tie all these principles together, you find out that, you can really make the world whole and enrich the third world countries, not with your tax money or right. with foreign aid, but by just setting the example. And unfortunately, we haven't done that. We've actually been quite a bully with other countries.
Right. Yeah. And in the Middle East is a perfect example of that with some of the damage that has been done over there. You can't make up for it.
That's right. And I talk about that as well, and some other ways we could have handled it. I talk about how the fact that actually, our defense per se isn't all that good. There was a gentleman, his name is escaping me now, but I did write about it in Healing, who was one of the first Navy SEALs, and he was assigned for himself and like 5 others to infiltrate the Navy bases and, pretend they were terrorists and capture everybody. And they succeeded very well. And the defense that the people in command of these bases were, because they got, the commanders got a week's notice that these guys were coming. So it wasn't like out of the blue. Huh. And still it only took them like an hour or two to capture the base. And the commanders said their excuse, the kind of excuses they used went along the lines of, well, they came in the back way. We weren't prepared.
Did you expect them to come in the front door?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and they, basically this guy was jailed for a while because so many higher ups were angry at him. And it's definitely Rogue Warrior is the name of the book, and I'm blanking out on his name right now, but definitely worth it's, especially if you're into the idea of national defense as a government function. It's definitely worth looking at, because what you do is you see how this monopoly that government has on national defense has really weakened our national defense. We actually have more of a national offense and not a defense. And it's pretty scary when you think about 9/11, because you definitely want to make sure that at least our home bases are protected. And this guy basically showed that they weren't.
Is this guy, the author's name Richard Marcinko?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Rogue Warrior, yes. He has a very interesting life. He's written a series of fiction books that maybe aren't so fictional. So
right,
you can enjoy his. But Rogue Warrior was kind of an autobiography.
Right. Yeah, that one sounds interesting. That's really funny that. But actually, it sounds very typical that he would expose the weaknesses in some of these bases, and of course the higher ups would retaliate against him for it.
Exactly. Well, exactly. Just like they did with Snowden, You're showing that Snowden showed that the NSA was breaking the law, and so he was condemned. And Richard Marcinko showed that, we really didn't have much defense, and of course he was jailed. It's really scary.
And look what happened. Look what happened with Julian Assange and Bradley Manning too.
Exactly.
They said we're running an illegal war over here, and they're shooting up civilians. And they immediately Manning was put in prison for violating classified information regulations, and of course they tried to push treason. And then they wanted to bust Julian Assange for treason, and then they were openly talking about it. Everybody was talking about Julian Assange committed treason, which he didn't because he's not a U.S. citizen. But they got the information out there, and it exposed what was going on, and then the retaliation starts.
That's right. That's right.
So,
Yeah.
And they were good. Then they actually got rid of Pat Tillman before he got to come back and say anything.
Yeah, I very vaguely remember his story.
Pat Tillman was playing with the Arizona Cardinals when 9/11 happened, and out of that big push of patriotism, he joined the Army, and I think he went into the Green Berets. I don't remember that one real clear. I'd have to reread it again, but he went over there into Afghanistan and Iraq and all of that, and he saw what was going on, and he would come back and say, look, this isn't what we're doing over there is not what you're being told in the U.S. And in his last tour in the Middle East, he was going to come back and tell everybody, that basically we were being given the wrong information in order to keep us, America's pushing behind the war, keep the population here, saying, yes, we need to keep up the fight. And he was going to come back and say, no, you guys don't understand what's happening over here. Let me tell you. Well, then on his last tour, he happened to be taken out by friendly fire. So he never got a chance to come back here and say anything. But, so I think that's the other thing that people are afraid of when it comes to challenging our government and pushing the freedom that libertarians do is the fact that they don't want to be retaliated against. Well,
of course not. Who would?
Right. I mean, look at what's happening now since Donald Trump got elected to office. I mean, I like some of the stuff he does. I hate some of the other stuff that he does. But the deep state entrenched in our government, they absolutely have gone ballistic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is a huge pushback going on right now. And what did Donald Trump say? I wanted to put America before everybody else because that's who I represent. And it's like, wait a minute, we got a lot of other things going on here that you're gonna screw the pooch on.
Yeah, it's really we've got so many entrenched special interests now.
Yeah.
It's the only I don't know if I would say it's good news, but at least sometimes they square off against each other.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes they end up eating their own sometimes, and it's just like, well, okay, less work for me to do.
Well, the thing is, of course, the bad news is that our country could be so much wealthier and vibrant than it is. We could have so much more, and by more, I don't mean more gadgets, but I mean we could have the wealth of cures for cancer and cures for other disease, cures for old age, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have those things because we are wasting our talent and resources on things that should never be happening. And it's very sad.
Yeah.
The thing is, if we recognize it, we can turn it around. And maybe it's not so strange that we've had this backlash, because if you think about it, for thousands upon thousands of years, we were impoverished and we were barely surviving as a species. And we've had a burst of freedom. We've had the prosperity that comes from it. But, that's a big change. And I guess one should expect some backlash, which is what we're experiencing now.
Right.
But the knowledge that freedom is the primary mover behind prosperity, I don't think that knowledge can go away. I mean, I realize there are some people who don't believe it, but enough people understand it that I think that knowledge is here to stay. And eventually, I think that will drive a lot of change. So let's hope so anyhow.
Yeah. I always like it when people do finally wake up. Some of the people I talk to never will, but some of them do. Mm-hmm. And when you see that light bulb go on, it's always great. And I am always reminded of this one little bit where it says, what has been seen cannot be unseen, or what has been learned cannot
Yes,
be unlearned.
that's right.
And
Even
it doesn't matter how much you try to stuff that, outside people will try to stuff that genie back in the bottle. It's not going back in.
that's right.
So, I always keep hope that enough people will finally, the little light bulb will go on, and there'll be enough, a bigger push, even bigger than what Ron Paul had, because he had a huge push going behind him,
Hmm.
and we'll get back to where we're supposed to be. We'll put, we'll be a free country again.
Hmm. Well, there's nothing stronger than a biological imperative, and that's what we have.
Right.
Freedom is a biological imperative for us. So, that's a pretty big push. If we don't blow ourselves up, we will eventually become a libertarian world.
Yeah, self-preservation is a strong motivator.
Yes.
Okay, well, actually, we're coming just about to the end of the time that I have allotted for the show, so it was great to have you on. Go ahead and give out your contact information again. Let everybody know once again where they can pick up your books, and I would highly recommend everybody read them.
Sure. Well, of course, you can get my books on Amazon, but you can also learn more about me and go to my free library at ruwart.com, RUWART.com. My free library has the 1993 edition of Healing Our World, so you can look that over and decide if you want to get the 2015 edition, which has a foreword by Ron Paul. And of course, Short Answers to the Tough Questions is another one of my books. It's from an e-zine that I wrote for the Advocates for Self-Government for 20 years. It gives soundbite answers to get people interested in asking you more about the libertarian philosophy. And finally, my newest, Death by Regulation, How We Were Robbed of a Golden Age of Health and How We Can Reclaim It, which talks about the FDA and how it's shaved 5 to 10 years off each of our lives.
Okay, great. As soon as I get done reading this book, I'm going to give you a call back,
Sure.
and
Feel free.
like to have you back on the show at some point in the future, if you don't mind.
Oh, I'd love to.
Okay, great. All right, thank you, Mary Ruwart, for coming on the show, and we will catch up with you again later at some point.
Sounds good.
Okay, great.
Have a great day, and I hope